On a tense night in Mississippi, the air felt heavier than usual, not because of the weather, but because of hatred hanging over a small southern town. Behind the stage lights that were about to come on, a young man stood in silence. Elvis Presley, not yet a legend, but already bold enough to make many people uneasy. Mississippi at that time was not a welcoming place for change. Racial lines were sharply drawn, embedded in laws, customs, and collective fear. Elvis's music, deeply influenced by African American blues and gospel, was seen as more than entertainment. To many, it was a threat to the old order. Every movement of his body, every note he sang, felt like a challenge to rules that had been enforced for decades through intimidation and violence. The threats began quietly, first as whispers backstage, then as clearer, colder warnings. One name surfaced repeatedly, spoken in hushed but serious tones: the Ku Klux Klan. For those who knew Mississippi's history, that name was not an empty rumor. It was not a bluff. It carried real weight, real danger. The message was simple and terrifying. Cancel the show, change your performance, or face the consequences. Around Elvis, tension grew. Managers and crew members exchanged worried looks, calculating risks. Some urged him to cancel the performance altogether. Others begged him to tone it down, to sing more cleanly, move more safely. Every suggestion was logical. No one wanted bloodshed over a concert. Elvis listened quietly. His face remained calm, but inside his thoughts were racing. He was not naive. He understood exactly what he was facing. He knew the danger was real. But deep within him there was something even more frightening than physical harm: the idea of losing who he truly was. In the quiet of the dressing room, far from the noise of the crowd, Elvis finally spoke. His voice was soft, without anger or dramatic bravado. He said he would go on stage exactly as he always did, not louder, not softer, not to provoke, but not to surrender either. Music to him was honesty, and the moment he began lying on stage, it would mean nothing anymore. When the curtain opened, the crowd erupted in cheers, yet beneath the applause, an invisible tension filled the room. Most people had no idea what had happened backstage, but they could feel it. Something was different that night. A quiet resolve hung in the air. Elvis stepped toward the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his steps were steady. When he began to sing, his voice carried a deeper intensity than usual. Every note sounded deliberate. Every movement felt like a conscious choice. He did not change who he was. He did not ask permission. He did not apologize. Midway through the performance, the room seemed to hold its breath, not out of fear, but out of awe. In a place where silence was often chosen for safety, Elvis spoke through his music, declaring without words that hatred did not get to control a human voice. The night ended without violence. There were no attacks, no riots, but the impact was far greater than anything physical. News of Elvis's stance spread quickly, from person to person, from town to town. He was no longer seen as just a talented singer, but as someone who stood firm when tested by real danger. For many young people, especially those living under pressure and fear, that moment became a symbol. If a young man from Memphis could stand his ground in the face of intimidation, then perhaps change was possible. Not at once, not easily, but always beginning with a single act of courage.
Elvis's response that night was never written into a manifesto. It was never recorded as a historic speech. There is no monument to it, and yet that is where its power lies. It showed that true courage sometimes means simply refusing to back down, refusing to let fear reshape who you are. Years later, when his name had become legendary and his music crossed generations, the story of that night in Mississippi continued to live on, not as a tale of terror, but as a story of choice. A choice to stand, a choice to be honest, a choice to not let hatred decide the direction of a life. And from a single stage in Mississippi, history trembled, not from violence, but from the courage of a young man who chose to keep singing.
In the end, that night in Mississippi was not remembered for the threats whispered behind the scenes, nor for the fear that briefly froze everyone involved. It was remembered for something far quieter, yet far more powerful. A choice. The choice of a young man to refuse to let hatred decide who he would become. There was no triumphant applause when Elvis Presley walked off the stage that night, no heroic announcement, no headline immediately marking his courage as history. He simply left the venue the same way he had on countless other nights, guitar in hand, exhausted, unnoticed. And yet, without realizing it, something had changed, not in the world around him, but within him. Because true courage rarely feels like courage in the moment. It feels like fear held tightly in place, like a trembling inner voice that still chooses to move forward. That night, Elvis had no idea his decision would echo far beyond the walls of that small performance hall. To him, it was just another test in a life that would hold many, but to history, it was an early portrait of who he would become. An artist who did more than entertain, someone who quietly stood at the edge of cultural change, not with speeches, not with demands, but with the simple, stubborn consistency of being himself, even when it was dangerous. As time passed, Elvis's name grew into a symbol. He became an icon, a legend, the king of rock and roll. Yet beneath the glitter of fame runs a thread often forgotten, that none of it was born from safety. It was forged in tension, in nights where retreat felt wiser than courage, in moments when stepping back seemed far more reasonable than stepping forward. We often speak of bravery as something loud and explosive, but more often courage arrives in its simplest form, refusing to change, refusing to shrink to satisfy the fears of others, refusing to silence one's inner truth just to make life easier. Elvis did not set out to be a hero. He did not openly confront anyone. He simply refused to be silenced, and that quiet refusal became one of the loudest statements possible in that era. For the young people who witnessed or later heard of that moment, his stance became a mirror. It revealed that art is not merely entertainment, that music can be honesty, and that sometimes standing on a stage and remaining yourself can be more dangerous and more meaningful than 1,000 spoken protests. History rarely records moments like this. It prefers explosions, visible conflicts, and clear victories. But real change often begins quietly, in cramped dressing rooms, in decisions never captured on camera, decisions witnessed only by one's own conscience. That night in Mississippi did not immediately change the world. No laws collapsed the next morning. No hatred disappeared overnight. But it planted something, a silent message that fear does not always win, that intimidation does not always succeed, that one person's refusal to bow can shake foundations that seem unbreakable. When Elvis later faced other pressures, from the industry, from fame, from the crushing weight of expectation, the imprint of that night remained. He had learned that standing firm is not about winning or losing, it is about surviving as yourself, and that lesson was born not from success, but from threat.
Perhaps that is why this story still matters today, because it is not only about Elvis, it is about anyone who has ever been cornered by fear, anyone who has been asked to make themselves smaller in order to be accepted, anyone whose voice nearly disappeared because the world felt too hostile. This story reminds us that not all victories are visible, not all courage is celebrated, yet every time someone chooses not to surrender to fear, the world shifts, slightly, quietly, towards something more honest. Elvis did not know that night would become part of the larger narrative of his life. He only knew he did not want to live with the regret of silence. And sometimes that is enough, because history is not always shaped by the loudest voices, but by the most consistent ones. On that small stage in Mississippi, no monument was raised, no plaque was installed, but courage happened. And courage, no matter how quietly it appears, never truly disappears. It lives on in stories, in inspiration, in the choices of others who later face their own fears. So when we hear Elvis's songs today, perhaps we are hearing more than music. Perhaps we are hearing the echo of a silent night when a young man chose to keep singing, not because he was unafraid, but because he refused to let fear control his life. And from that simple choice, a legend was not only born, but defined.